Hey, good afternoon, everybody. I really like the theme of Oasis for a Wednesday afternoon here. Does that stand for anything as an acronym, Marie? Well, today we'll let it stand for, yeah. Today we'll let it stand for offering anyone safety in storytelling. Okay, that'll be it for today. The sheets I've passed out, we're not going to make use of particularly, but they're just for your to have in your possession to use as you'd like to sometime. Years ago, I heard a quote from a guy named Ralph Milton, and this is how it went. Come, my friend, tell me your story, and I'll tell you mine. We'll sit and laugh. We'll drink a toast to God who loves us, to Emmanuel, God with us. And we'll share how Christ died and lives in us and among us, and how we live in him. Come, my friend. That quote just stuck with me, and over the years has just been so valuable in reminding me how important it is as a community, or a community of faith particularly, to be sharing our stories. Let me start with one. This is not a personal story, but it speaks about story. King Clarane was betrayed by his wife. She was unfaithful to him. He became very bitter, angry, and developed a strong distaste and distrust towards women. And as part of his rage as the king, he would have a woman marry him for a day, and then in the morning have her beheaded. And so the days went. That's how his life was. He'd marry a woman for a day, he'd kill her, and then the next day have a new wife. Well, word about this leaked, and there was a young woman who was offered to the king in marriage, but she decided, because she used her head, because she didn't want to lose her head. And here's what she did. Every night when they retired for bed, she'd tell him a story. Then she would fake like she was tired and sleepy and fell asleep before finishing the story. But the king, by this time, was so enraptured by the story, he wanted to know the ending. So what did he do? He kept her alive for one more night. But this is how the whole process went. For 1,000 nights, this gal told him a story, unfinished, and therefore he wanted to hear how it ended. Well, you can imagine after 1,000 nights, the king, by this time, was healed of his anger. And the woman, she fell in love with him. Her name was Scheherazade. You've probably heard that story in the course of your lives. And that's just a variation of it. But that story speaks to the power of story, doesn't it? How really it can become so engaging, and it has healing power. It has life-giving power. It has all kinds of positive aspects to it. Last Christmas, well, it was actually for my birthday in 2023, my sons got for me a subscription to Storyworth. I imagine some of you have heard of Storyworth. Maybe some of you have been part of Storyworth in your lives. How many have heard of Storyworth? Several of you have. Have you done it, Jean? Or Carolyn, you did. You started it, didn't you? Just barely. Well, it takes discipline, because what I handed out to you on that one sheet is the story worth questions I answered over the course of the last year. There are 52 of them. You get one question every Monday morning. They'll send a question, and then you have a week to answer it, and then they send the next one the next Monday morning. It takes discipline to complete the process, and sometimes things happen. You know how this goes. Things get busy, and so sometimes the stories would amass, the questions would amass, and I'd have to get several done in 1 week. But by the time of the year ending, I had done 52 stories. Now, all of these questions, most of them were created by our son Eric. There were some suggestions, I think, but he is the one that identified almost all of the stories until maybe the last 4, 5, or 6, when I asked each of the sons if there was a question they wanted me to answer. And then I answered some of my own creation. That's how the process went. The outcome is going to be a memoir in a bound book when they get around to getting that arranged. My one regret is I did not include pictures, because I've had some person send me one of their story-worth memoirs, and the pictures were very helpful to have along with it. So that's what I wish I had done. Maybe there's still time for me to do it. I do not know. Well, today I'm going to share with you one of the stories that I wrote for that memoir. And then I'm going to include a story from the second sheet that I passed out, questions, items to consider when reflecting on your spiritual story. I'll share on one of those questions as well. First of all, I am dealing with question 8 on the sheet of story worth questions. What's a small decision you made that ended up having a big impact on your life? I don't like to read what I'm sharing, but I'm going to for this story because this is what is going to be in the book. Okay? I'm going to share with you the words that I wrote for that question. Before I start, are you anyone here know what an Adonis is? Adonis. What's an Adonis? It's a very good-looking guy. Okay, to be simple. Anyway, I use that word. That's why I have never been anything close to an Adonis in my life. And throughout the vast majority of my teenage high school years, never developed a mutually satisfying and lasting dating relationship. I was generally known as a nice guy and had good friends, but when it came to young women, I was usually on the outside looking in when it came to finding a good match. During my high school years, one of my best friends was a young man named Rich Bucher. He attended the same church as I did, and our church youth group typically met on Sunday nights. Afterwards, we would often go to his place, sit outside in one of our cars, and talk about matters that were important to us. He became my best friend in my high school years. During my senior year, for a significant length of time, Rich dated a young woman named Paulette Luganbill, who was also part of our same church. I found Paulette to be a very attractive person myself. But on the one hand, I never had any indication that she had any interest in me at all. Besides, she was 2 grades younger. And there were plenty of other guys who were attracted to her even before she began dating Rich. And on the other hand, I never considered taking any initiative in relation to her because Rich was such a dear friend, and I would never have wanted to hurt him and or harm our friendship. One Sunday night, though, as we were sitting outside of Rich's house, Rich confessed to me that he and Paulette had come to an amicable agreement that it was time to bring their dating relationship to a close, because the signals had become increasingly clear that there wasn't the right chemistry or sufficient romantic connection or whatever to continue going forward together. It's my recollection that after this, I commiserated with Rich for a time, but then, after a short pause, Rich spoke some words that, at least at the time, stunned me. Quote, "Doug, why don't you date Paulette?" I experienced those words as both an act of magnanimity and blessing from Rich, but also, to a shy person like myself, a rather intimidating prospect. The thought of being with Paulette, though titillating, was also threatening. After all, who was I to ask out a lovely young woman like Paulette, whom, even though I had some abiding, positive, even romantic feelings toward her, there was never any signal that such feelings were mutual. I could hardly imagine that she would be interested in me. I was pretty much bound by inertia. Then something happened that catalyzed me, made me come alive. Our church's big Mennonite sanctuary had a balcony, and often the young teenage men would sit up in the balcony, and the young women would sit down below. We were within the gaze of each other. At least that was the case on this particular Sunday that I'll be referencing, which was some weeks after Rich's word of encouragement to me. I remember sitting in the balcony and at one point looking down at Paulette. Simultaneously, I experienced her gazing up at me with that look. And when our eyes met, I found the way she looked at me to be something akin to an epiphany, a moment of enlightenment, a feeling of connection. For the historical record, to this day, Paulette has no recollection of this moment at all. However, for me, it was empowering. Within a short time, I mustered the courage to ask Paulette to be my date for our high school's junior-senior prom. Even though her initial response was to demur, she said, "I'll need to ask my parents." Remember, she was a sophomore, I was a senior. I sensed an overtone of receptivity in her voice, and when I hung up the phone, my spirit was light and I was at peace. To make a longer story shorter, Paulette eventually accepted my invitation to be my date for the prom, and this was the first step in a courtship that lasting about 6 years. A relationship that subsequently consummated in marriage, which in turn has now lasted almost 56 years. My small decision, although it was a big step for me to take at the time, to ask Paulette to the prom, ended up having life-changing and life-bettering implications for me. Paulette's the best thing that ever happened to me. As more than one person has told me over the years in relation to Paulette, "Doug, how could you get so lucky?" What can I say but it's a gift, and the gift goes on. I brought 3 pictures, which I'll put out when you leave, if you're interested. One of them is a picture of me in those days. I look a whole lot different. One's a picture of, the closest picture I have of Paulette with that look. and then a picture of our first date at the prom. Okay? I'll take those out when we're finished here. Then I want to share a story on your sheet of the spiritual story questions. Number 3. Tell us about a person, now dead, who made a big difference to you in your spiritual walk. What difference did that person make to you? I was a Mennonite pastor in Wayland, Iowa, and we had our district conference in a place called Pandora, Ohio, where Paulette and I both grew up. And I remember that the special speaker for the conference was a person who many of you maybe even knew, but certainly have heard of, Art Gish. And Art was presenting some things on the simple life. After the plenary sessions, Art had a workshop on the simple life. And I went to that workshop. And as the workshop unfolded, I just felt like it was so heady and so dead. I'm not blaming Art, but the group wasn't engaged. I remember saying to myself quietly, would someone please do something? If you've been in that position, what have you often heard in response from God? You're somebody. Yeah, what about you? And so I remember I mustered the courage to share my own journey in struggling with the simple life. And as my story unfolded, then after that, it seemed like the whole group kind of got energized and picked up some things, and it went much better. Afterwards, as I was milling around in the gathering place, a woman approached me with fire in her eyes. I was sure she was mad at me. And she approached me head on and said, "Who are you?" I said, "Well, what do you say at that?" I said, "I'm Doug Reichenbach." And she said, "Well, Doug Reichenbach, I want you to know something. I've been around this world, and I've met people, and I've met real people, and you're a real person." Turns out that woman was a missionary, a Mennonite missionary to India. And she had just retired and come back to the States. And she had been around the world. And that word to me, "You are a real person," was more suggestive than reality, because I struggled with being real and open and honest, like I'm sure you have at times in your lives. But that was like that day, a dam broke, and I began the process of trying to do what Jesus said in John 3:21, the true person comes to the light, so that it can clearly be seen that I, God, am in everything that he or she does. Or the words of Peter, "You're all newborn, and as babies, you should be hungry for nothing but milk," the spiritual milk, I mean, of spiritual honesty, "so that you may grow up to your salvation. Surely you've tasted that the Lord is good." Well, there's just two stories. I would love to sit down with all of you and hear some of your stories. Which do any of these grab you, particularly these questions that you'd like to hear from, say, your spouse or from someone you know, or you'd like to share even today? Is there a quick story that comes to mind for you in response to one of these questions? Yeah, okay. Yeah. And to think about what's stopping us, what's stopping us from pursuing it. Anyone else have one that kind of sticks out to you as being important? Yeah. Yeah, it's great. Well, it's 4:25, and I just commend storytelling to all of you. I'm not saying you've got to do StoryWorth, but that's one way to get this done as a discipline. And if you've ever, I would rather have someone just interview me and they do all the work of writing things down. But this is how it unfolded. I'm glad I did it, and I wish the best for all of you in that same regard. That you may perhaps grow up in your own salvation and further taste how good the Lord is and how good the Lord has been in your life, with the mothers that we've been raised with the dreams that we still have, the longings that we still have. Um, it's a way to me, build a really deepening community. Come, my friends, tell me your stories. I'll tell you mine. We'll drink a toast to God who loves us, Emmanuel, God with us, and we'll share about Christ who died and lives in us and among us. Come, tell me your stories. Amen.